Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just got into the transfer portal, kind of our last wrap up for the winter transfer portal. Definitely a lot of things that really went crazy, especially that wide receiver group. Going to be a very interesting thing to watch as we go throughout spring. But let's get into kind of a weekend wrap up here. Definitely some things that I want to get into as we go into the weekend. And we'll start with that big time hire that the Cincinnati Bengals made in Al Golden. Al Golden has been hired by the Cincinnati Bengals away from Notre Dame, and Notre Dame is officially on the market for a defensive coordinator. They joined Penn State, Oklahoma, a couple other teams that are still on the prowl for what their DC is going to be, and a lot of them are going after Jim Knowles right about now. So that'll be an interesting thing to watch. We'll talk about that next week. It sounds like Penn State put a lot of money on the table for possible Jim Knowles getting Jim Knowles. But overall, for the Cincinnati Bengals, they got a very good defensive coordinator. There's no doubt about that. 14.3 points per game, second in the country, was only gave up 298 yards per game, top 10 in the country. They were elite. There's no doubt about that. Definitely a group that was very, very talented, and a group that was very obviously good, well coached. They made just about every single tackle in front of them, had very, very few coverage breakdowns, even against a team like Ohio State, where played incredibly good football, but you had Jeremiah Smith, you had Emeka Buka on the other side. That was the reality of that game, and overall, I don't think it's a huge indictment of Al Golden by any means. So I think it's a solid hire by Cincinnati. He goes back to the place that he was there before Notre Dame and had done a great job there with the linebackers. He finally comes back with that DC position and makes a little bit of sense. There was a lot of quiet out of Cincinnati the last couple of weeks, and it was because they were waiting on this guy to finish the job. So a very, very talented coordinator. We'll see what they do at Notre Dame in that position. We'll see what Penn State does, if they can pick up Jim Knowles, if Oklahoma can find a way to do that. There will be a lot of different things that will be really interesting to watch as we finish off this coaching carousel, but there's obviously one more twist to it, and it could have a couple more, depending on what happens with that Jim Knowles character. Deion was hit with a little bit of a recruiting violation from the NCAA. It sounds like he was live streaming on the Deion Sanders coaching show, and he had 2 episodes where he discussed Juju Lewis, the very talented quarterback that has now signed with the Buffaloes. He was talking about him before he signed with the Buffaloes. So relatively minor violation in every sense of the word. Colorado self-reported it. Not a big deal, if I'm being totally honest. So it'll be interesting to see what happens from this. Now, Deion Sanders will have to we'll have to attend additional rules education sessions, and we'll have to do an imposed reduction in 4 in-person recruiting days during the 2025 spring contact period. Now, I think we all understand that Deion Sanders doesn't do a ton of home visits now. He started to do that just a little bit more, but obviously will not be a huge deal for him. Overall, this is not necessarily a thing that we need to talk about too much. Definitely something that will probably get a little bit more run than it probably should throughout the next couple of days, but he's done an incredible job there. Obviously, there's a little bit of a misstep. Not a big deal by any means. So it'll be interesting to see what happens and if there's any more fallout from this or there's any more violations that come from this, but as of right now, it does not seem to be a big deal by any means, and seems to be that Deion's going to be more than fine heading into next year. The ACC is possibly changing their conference title, and it's going to be really interesting to see what happens here. It might have everything to do with what the CFP does this offseason and next offseason, because it sounds like that's what they're kind of gearing towards. So the idea, as it sits right now, is you would have sort of a play-in game. You wouldn't have a conference championship. You would have a play-in game between the numbers 2 and 3 teams in the conference, and then you have the number 1 team, the regular season champion, would remain idle. They would move on to the CFP. Obviously would not incur the penalty possibly that SMU might have gotten from that Clemson game. The number 1 team wouldn't have to worry about that in the ACC going forward. This would probably only happen if the ACC got, let's say, 2 auto bids, while the Big Ten and SEC got 3. So this is probably a 2026 and beyond problem, but I hate this. I'll be totally honest. I hate this with every fiber of my being, if I'm being totally honest, because conference championships should be conference championships. We should have a way to contextualize this the correct way and not bury teams for playing in them, but still put a lot of emphasis on them. It shouldn't be necessarily a super tough thing to do. For some reason, people are making it very, very tough. So this is something that was going to be talked about, changing up the conference championship. If you wanted to do a little bit of a tournament with the top 4 teams, then maybe I could get on board with that, but then you're just adding another game to these guys' schedule. But overall, I think there's a thing that I just hate. When you add more and more things that are going way, way towards the CFP and saying that our conference championship doesn't matter at all. It just matters who makes it to the CFP from our group. It's a very, very bad thing. And it's definitely a thing that could roll downhill very quickly and become something that we all hate in a lot of different ways. So I dislike this a lot of different ways. I hate the fact that you wouldn't have a conference championship and SMU would have been the champions of that conference, but as we saw, Clemson was able to beat them, so Clemson was the champions of that conference. So I hate this. I hope this does not happen. I think it probably won't, depending on the way that things go in the next couple of years, but at the end of the day, conferences have to still mean something. Conference championships still have to be conference championships, and I really won't budge on that, if I'm being totally honest. Now, there are some things that we can talk about as we go on the next iteration of this playoff, depending on how it plays out. We'll see what happens there, but overall, you got to keep emphasis on these championship games. And I think you move it to a 2 versus 3 matchup, you're going to have way less people watching, you're going to have way less interest, and you're going to have two teams that are fighting for a CFP spot, but they're not fighting for anything other than that. They're not fighting for the conference championship that they can take home. That's already in the hands of someone else. So I don't think it's a very good idea. I don't think it's an idea that I would back by any means, but it is also an idea that I understand where they're coming from in a couple of different ways, because if they're going to put all the emphasis on the CFP, you might as well do that at the conference level as well. So that'll be an interesting thing to watch. I don't like it by any means, but I can't say that it's not something that I can't say it won't happen by any means. So that'll be a very interesting thing to watch, and definitely something that I'm hoping doesn't happen, if I'm being totally honest. Bill Belichick officially signed his contract yesterday, and there were some worries about this. Probably shouldn't have been all that worried, if I'm being totally honest, but the deal has a ton of incentives in it, has a ton of different things that could possibly make him one of the highest paid coaches in the country. A 5-year deal, pay him $10 million a year annually. Obviously, a lot of the different incentives in there will bump that up just a little bit more, and definitely some great things within that. Now, the big thing that we did talk about earlier is a $10 million buyout right now. After June 1st, it'll be a $1 million buyout. That'll be an interesting thing to watch. Throughout 2025, he will be a name talked about with the NFL jobs. He will be a name talked about with probably other coaching jobs as well in the college football world. It'll be interesting to watch this one unfold. I don't necessarily think he's going to be at UNC for a very long time. I think he's going to be a guy that probably there for a year, maybe 2, but at the end of the day, very, very talented head coach, obviously, and definitely a guy that it'll be really interesting to see how this unfolds. He did an incredible job, obviously, in his NFL career. This is obviously a little bit different, no doubt about that, and that'll be really interesting to watch. He's off to a relatively good start in the recruiting world and the portal world, but definitely some things that he's going to have to figure out as he moves forward, and it'll be really awesome to watch this unfold. I think all of us are very interested to see what they can do. Also, another thing for UNC is their home opener against TCU will be on that Monday night, so they'll get that Monday night game. I think they wanted that to be a little bit standalone with Bill Belichick, so makes total sense. Will be awesome to see what he can do in 2025. Beyond that, I have to assume he's probably going to be somewhere else. If I'm being totally honest, probably back up in the NFL, but maybe not. Maybe he's hanging out in Chapel Hill, and maybe some special times are coming that direction. Then we have the Xavier Lucas situation. He is enrolled in Miami. He is no huge update from Wisconsin, and frankly, I don't think you're going to get one over the next couple of weeks. I don't think there necessarily is much to be said at this point. The NCAA has said that no rules were violated in terms of the transfer portal. There are some things to talk about with some different contracts were signed, but let's be totally honest. There's not a lot of enforceability in the NCAA right now. There's not a lot of things that you can really enforce in the college football level. So I don't necessarily think this is going to be that big of a story after a couple of weeks, if I'm being totally honest. I think this is going to be something where Wisconsin and the Big Ten figure out pretty quickly that they're probably not going to win this battle, and even if they do, it's probably going to give them a bigger headache than it's worth. You probably just let the guy walk out the door, and they did, and obviously a very interesting situation, one that probably doesn't incline a lot of guys to really go to Wisconsin and lean into them, but it'll be an interesting thing to watch. There's no doubt about that. But overall, it's not going to be a story in a couple of weeks if I had to imagine. If it is, then maybe Wisconsin has a little bit more evidence than I'm thinking of right now in the tampering part of this, but I don't think they do. And even if they do, I don't think teams want to go after teams for tampering really that much, because they understand the game. They understand that they're taking part in that just as much as everyone else. So I don't think anything's going to come from this one. If I'm being totally honest, I think Xavier Lucas will play for Miami, and he'll be a very talented player for them. So as much as we'll focus on the outside stuff, this is a very good piece for them, and definitely a guy that I think could be on the field very early for Miami. And then let's talk about the CFP title. I said ratings, excuse me. But the ratings for the national championship did suffer this year. Got down to 22.1 million. It was the most watched CFP game. It was the most watched non-NFL sporting event this past year. The problem with that is just this past year, the Michigan-Washington game was up near 25 million. So you got a problem. There's no doubt about that. And there's definitely some things that need to be figured out with this thing. I think the biggest thing is just the scheduling of it all. I think a lot of people woke up on Monday and said, oh, yeah, there's a national title today. That should never be the way that we go about it. It should always be counting down the days till that game officially happens. Felt like we lost a lot of momentum between that number, that's between the 10th and between the 20th. I feel like we lost a lot of juice in the college football season. They're going to have to find a way to kind of condense this thing back down just a little bit more. It'll be interesting to see what they do over the next couple of years. Probably won't be until 2026 where we see a couple of these things kind of come into effect, but it's going to be an interesting thing to watch. People are a little bit less interested than they were before. There's a ton of different reasons why some people are uninterested. NIL, transfer portal has definitely hurt some of the fans' interest, but at the end of the day, I think you're going to get plenty of people if you really lean into this thing, if you make it the A-plus product that it absolutely can be, and get a little bit closer to that 25 million that you very much like to be at, and maybe get up from there. There's some really incredible games. You go all the way back to 2014, that was about 34 million. So there's definitely a tapering off. There's no doubt about that, and definitely something that maybe we'll get into a little bit more detail next week, talk about the real trends and definitely some things that are worrisome. There's no doubt about that. So we'll talk about that and definitely get into that in a little bit more detail next week. But overall, I do think it's a scheduling issue. I think the engagement of regular sports fans really kind of tapered off between the 10th semifinals and the 20th championship. You're going to have to find a way to keep the attention. So probably a little bit less time, probably a little bit more intensiveness on those games, and probably just moving a little bit quicker throughout the CFP. But that'll be an interesting thing to watch. Definitely something that they're going to have to find a way to figure out. Now, I've never been one that really cares too much about ratings. I'm watching the game. If I enjoyed the game and enjoy the players that are on the field, I have no problem. But I understand this is a business. I understand how this works, and you're definitely going to need a little bit more from those ratings as you move forward throughout the rest of the next couple of years, especially into possibly an expanded playoff format. But going to be really interesting to watch all of this unfold, and we're officially into the offseason. You turn your page onto the 2020 or on the 2024 season to the 2025, and we'll get into all the details on that with spring camp, with quarterbacks, with all the different things to watch as we get into spring camp. We'll get into some freshmen to watch next week, but at the end of the day, that'll do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all the social pages for all the content and updates you could possibly need. We have great people covering every single sport you could want. So anything in the world of sports you need, come on over to GSMC and we have you totally covered. But thank you once again for listening, and I will see you guys on Monday.